Okay. So first, I mean, it's worth sort of saying that the things that we're going to be doing with Photoshop and perspectives aren't necessarily supposed to be photorealistic, but I would call them more of like photo montages, collaging, really trying to tell a story. And sometimes you rely more on photorealism, other times you rely more on other compositional principles. So let's talk about this just for a moment. I have a number of slides that we're going to go through, but I found that they're really useful to sort of show examples and talk a little bit about things. If I don't show these, I can't describe, I mean, pictures worth a thousand words, right? And at the same time, it sort of covers things I might forget otherwise, right? So you can always think in terms of color, right? I mean, take a look at this one. This looks like some sort of Highline-like project on an old elevated rail lines in the middle of a existing fabric city. What they've done is they've taken the photograph and graded out, and then everything that they've added color to then is the sort of new design, right? So you can sort of understand. And in fact, the idea is to sort of reinvigorate an old area with something new. And in this case, looking at plants, plantings, street furniture along this elevated rail line become the High Line. So again, one of these things that I'll sort of bring up over and over and over again. We'll talk about this. We already talked about this a bit with your diagrams too. This idea of color, right? Color is you don't want it to be a crutch, but if you use it very strategically, it can become a very powerful tool in your tool belt to sort of provide visual emphasis in the places that you want, right? In this case, to the actual project that we would be looking at, while still including but grayed out all of this sort of context that it's responding to and placed within. Compositional rules. How many of you dabbled in photography or heard of the rule of thirds, right? For instance, on a lot of cameras, even smartphone cameras now, you could even toggle on the grid and it's sort of a 3 by 3 grid, sort of breaking up the screen into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. That's a really famous compositional tool. Again, it's a grid, not a big surprise there, but a way to sort of organize and arrange compositionally your photos, your collages, your renderings, etc. Right? So here's an example of that, right? Sort of trying to make things hit those close to those third lines. Um, Sometimes it's about having emphasis in all three bays. And of course, again, it's not drawn here, but you can always think in terms of a rule of thirds with horizontal lines as well. Here we have a very strong horizontal. I mean, we see the horizon way off in the distance. And so, yeah, here we have, um, this sort of 1 point perspective reinforced in the center. Then we have something on the left and something on the right. But having some things that actually line up with these thirds lines can be really, really helpful. And then activity and atmosphere, right? So you could take something that looks like maybe um, New York Harbor or something, um, and uh, and then start to insert your own, like let's say ground surface and things like that. But really what activates this is having lots and lots of people sort of showing this as a beach, right? Now suddenly we understand it's a recreational space. That you would come here and maybe lay out on a blanket, bring the kids so they can splash around. There's seagulls flying overhead. Maybe you're even planting some really fast-growing bamboo or something. Maybe this is part of a resilience plan. The whole idea is that, you're basically creating coastline that can absorb water when you actually have flooding. But then the other 364 days of the year when you don't need that, it's park, right? Or recreation. It gets a give back to the community. And so suddenly when this is like 5 feet underwater, it doesn't necessarily matter. You just don't go to the beach that day, right? Let's see. So this idea of sort of adding ambiance, activity, atmosphere, program, the sort of verbs, right? People throwing the frisbee around or putting on sunscreen or a ferry boat floating by or something like that, right? To begin to show and how one might be immersed within that scene. Complementary colors. So we haven't really talked about color theory at all. And I'll try my best here with these crappy annotate tools. But if you think about a color wheel, I'll draw one wedge as red. This is a really bad green, but I'll draw the green right across from it, right? And you can imagine orange and yellow on this side, blue and violet on this side. But those primary and secondary colors, right? So red and blue make violet, blue and yellow make green, red and yellow make orange. Those are what show up on a color wheel. The reason we oftentimes arrange these things on a color wheel is because we talk about color schemes relative to their position on the color wheel. Sorry, my apologies for not being able to draw this very well with my mouse and pretty crude looking tools here. And it doesn't even have violet. Well, that's great. We'll use violet adjacent here, maybe some sort of lavender or something. Right. So of course we have our primary colors, right? These three. We have our secondary colors where we mix two primary colors together. We have tertiary, which are basically mixing, we get things like red orange, orange yellow, yellow greens, green blues, blue violets, violet reds. Um, but what you can see is that when we refer to complementary colors, we're talking about the two colors that are at opposite each other on the color wheel, right? So we might have things like red oranges and green blues, right? Like we see here. We might have reds, or sometimes we even call them split complementaries. Let's see here, where we have what's across and then split it off as well, right? So we have greens and golds along with some reds and oranges, etc., right? So there's different types of color schemes, but oftentimes when we're talking about complementaries, we're talking about what's across from each other. So green is a complement of red, orange and blue are complements, yellow and violet are complements. So oftentimes you see these combinations and logos, marketing, painting, etc., right? This idea that and you see these actually in nature a lot too. But for instance, I think about like NBA logos, right? Here's the Los Angeles Lakers, here's the New York Knicks. Green and red. I'm trying to think of the last place I saw green and red together. I mean, Christmas time, of course. Um, the last time I was at Red Rock and saw green creosote growing out of, some tanks in the red rocks. So anyway, that's just a little bit about color theory, right? So you can have analogous, let's say three colors next to each other, right? So maybe you have like a set of warm colors, red, oranges, and yellows. That's called analogous. You can have complements or split complements, right? You can have triadic, right? So you can say red, yellow, blue, or you can say, the other way around, violet, orange, and yellow, etc. All right. So enough of that. But that's what I mean when I'm talking about complementary colors. So here we have reds and greens. We have a little bit of gold and some other things miscellaneous. Again, not photorealistic. You can tell this is a collage, right? A digital one probably, although you could just as easily have been cutting figures out of a magazine and starting to layer things up, just like we used to do back in the old days, making these sort of really textured collages. All right. Again, another collage, not really photorealistic, even though we're sort of collaging a lot of different layers that were photos, like photos of flowers, photos of grasses, photos of trees, photos of sky, photos of humans. When we put them together, I think we can tell that this is actually a manipulated image, right? But here we can, again, have a very strong sort of basis for understanding, first of all, one point perspective. So we have a vanishing point right here. Everything sort of projects out from it. We have our horizon line. Actually, our horizon line's back here somewhere. We have our eye level. And we do have a very clear foreground, midground, and then way in the back of background with the sky and everything else. Okay. So again, all of these are ingredients for you to sort of play around with, think about, right? When you're doing one of these collages or perspectives, these are things you should be going over with yourself and sort of thinking about, right? Do I have a clear midground? Do I have a clear foreground versus background? Is the perspective clear? What kinds of colors am I using and why, right? Because what I would say is that, again, we have golds and we have violets. Those are complements. We have some greens, of course, and some a little bit of blue sky, but this is largely sort of gray, desaturated, not quite all the way, but sort of a group blue gray. And then we're also looks like they've done some things with the grasses and some of the greens, except for the tree line maybe, to sort of turn it olivey, trying to pull out some of the gold values from the greens, right? So again, these are ways you can begin to evaluate your own stuff as you're producing it, right? Compositionally, do I have rule of thirds? Where's the perspective? How do I begin to sort of play around with foreground, midground, background? And again, color, careful use of color. Complementary colors, activation, and proportions, right? So, what's interesting here is that let's talk about this, right? I mean, we can begin to talk about this. First of all, let's break this up into thirds, right? So you can see that we have the sort of skyline conforming along the rule of thirds. The trees also sort of contribute to some of that. But we have a very clear foreground. We have a very clear midground. We have a very clear background. Stuff that's off in the distance and just context. Um, right? We have the foreground where we're really looking, and then the midground is just a little, the extension of the foreground further back, sort of connective tissue between the foreground and the background. We have some warm browns, which are basically just red and orange tones combined, along with green, right? And then what's interesting is we have some pretty dynamic lines coming through here. In fact, oftentimes, if you're into painting, when the sort of in during the Baroque and Enlightenment, painting sort of shifted big time. You could actually you actually start to see more dynamic sort of angles and lines. In fact, sometimes you can always sort of trace triangles through some of these paintings, and this is similar, right? We start to see a set of triangles and ang really dynamic sort of angles, again, reinforcing that perspective, which is happening somewhere back here. But then we also have some angles that are, paths that aren't quite orthographic, right? They're not parallel to this path, etc. Right? So again, playing around with the sort of dynamics of angles can again lead your eye around the page, right? So I'm kind of curious, where's your eye drawn to? Right? Like this is almost like an arrow. You're it's like my eye sort of drifts up here and then moves back out again through one of these trajectories. So I'm always sort of led there and then back, there and then back, there and then back. I'm sort of looking around. I never really sort of look from here to here, which is I think is kind of interesting, right? But again, these are the tricks you can play, right? This is our craft when it comes to crafting drawings. To sort of really again think about the viewer and how much you want to direct one's eye around the page, screen, or whatever this is. All right, so emphasis through color. Um, what's interesting here is that we have the sort of darkest stuff here in the center, really sort of kind of a vibrant for brown, but also really dark, sort of a deep brown. Then we have highlights of greens and golds. We have a little bit of blue, but it's very sort of very monochromatic over here. Just a little bit of blue gray that sort of goes to white, tends to white. A little more about color, right? When we talk about saturation, we're talking about the amount of color. You desaturate a color completely, it goes to grayscale, black and white. Um, the other thing is we can also say shades and tints. So if we think about, a red values, like the hue is the color, like red or yellow or violet. If we think about red and we say we want a tint of red, then we start to add white to it. So lighter values of red are tints, and darker when we're adding black to the red value is shade. Right? So that's again just since we were talking about color theory before. But again, this really reinforces that perspective, right? I mean, very dynamic. Again, we see a set of triangles in the composition. Those always lend themselves to sort of moving your eyes around the screen in a really dynamic way. When done well, anyway. All right. I'll try to move a little faster here. Atmosphere, talking about dappled light, right? Shade and things like that. This idea that people are sort of sitting here and that people are milling around, not necessarily running through this thing, but taking advantage of it as a space, not just as a corridor to pass through. Complementary colors, framed view. All right. So again, here, what's interesting is that over on the left-hand side, we have a sort of visual weight here, right? Our our perspective, one of our points is actually on the screen. The other one is probably like way off here, but in fact, you can actually see it's way out here. But in fact, it would be going in this direction, right, as we start to make a grid across this ground plane. But when you do that, right, and then you start to have this weight at the left side, right, now you can start to play around with balance or imbalance, symmetry and asymmetry, right? So if you look at this, we have color here, pretty much grayscale up here, right? So we have a very heavy bottom to the image and a very much lighter top. But then we also have a weight to the left and lighter right side hand side. Look at that. And again, I mean, I would say, yeah, I guess there's a mid ground here. The foreground has a lot of detail, like these grass sort of poking through, growing through the sort of pavers here. Then we have a little bit of water, but really the strong contrast happens right here at this line, right? Everything below it seems to have color and saturation. The other one, not so much. Looking at neutral tones, again, sort of desaturating things and using greens and browns is more analogous. You start to see greens, some golds and some browns, but everything's sort of really subdued. Emphasis through color or lack thereof, right? Again, we can start to show material changes. Here someone photoshopped in a bunch of grass, like turf. Then we start to see that, there's seeding that's not softscape, but hardscape. Then we have hardscape path over here. Then we have what looks like a sort of, fountain mounding grass along the right, right? Then we have some trees throughout. Movement framed views. Again, rule of thirds, right? So here we have the perspective. Here we have the two sides, right? We definitely have some two, left and right periphery over here. So, I mean, oftentimes when I'm looking at your stuff, this is what I'm sort of judging it on, right? Like, balance wise, what do we have here? Um, you know, this one drives me crazy. Why does it drive me crazy? It really seems like the frame up at the top is a little too short and gets really close to the grass. Whereas down here we have a lot more room. I really wish this frame would extend just a little higher here, right? But this is a section perspective, right? So this is a section being cut through an elevated infrastructure. You can see the beams and slabs, right? They're being cut through. This would continue on this way if it wasn't, right? And we would have more trees and things like that up here, right? And then people walking from underneath it. So this is a section perspective, right? We're kind of experts on that now, at least dangerous enough to do some real damage with this. I'll try to speed some things up because I have more to sort of talk about here. Compositional unity, right? Now we could talk about what unity actually means, but let's just break this down, right? There's a very clear foreground, a very clear midground, and even up here, right? And a very clear background, right? So here we have foreground, midground, background. We have some trees over here on the left-hand side, sort of reinforcing the frame. We have something over here on the the top right. We have something over here on the bottom left, bottom right, right? Trying to sort of bring differing sort of weight to the side of the image. You can decide if that's balanced to you or not. I don't know. Color scheme wise, we have analogous, right? We have greens, golds, oranges, right? So that's one whole side of the color wheel, all sort of adjacent. All right, color is a design tool, right? In this case, talking about splashes of blooms and things like that across the screen. Now, suddenly, with these folks in the foreground, I understand I'm not really meant to look at these people and try to make them out, right? Like make out what they're saying or something. That the project is showing this, meadow that nature's sort of taken over, planting natural, maybe native plantings that sort of grow and aren't necessarily have to be cut and manicured and things like that, right? Color creating atmosphere. We start to see flowers in the foreground with a young child. We have a midground, but then, atmosphere, right? We have the lens flare, the light shining through the trees, dappled light. We have butterflies and pollen floating in the air, etc. Again, not photorealistic, not meant to be, still works, right? And I think that's the key, right? You can spend a lot of time trying to make something photorealistic, but this has an idea behind it, right? I can start to imagine, what this little girl's fancying, right? These, flowers and butterflies, a meadow, playing with friends. It sort of brings you back. It's sort of reminiscent, sort of back when you were a child, maybe. This idea of, nature being magical in some way, etc. Right? I mean, there's ideas behind this that I think are more powerful. It's telling a story rather than trying to be photorealistic to the maybe uh, and so that's the priority there is telling the story, showing a scene, providing the atmospherics. Environmental character, right? It's maybe not enough just to add some trees, but then to sort of make dappled shadows, to have some streaks of light, some light rays or volumetric lighting, sort of piercing through in some places, right? Again, not photorealistic. It's very much a collage, right? You can tell the folks, you have some cyclists and some people walking around, some fishing people, etc. Right? So, but you can imagine now suddenly, a city reclaims part of their riverfront or waterfront, and then suddenly converts it into a public space that everybody can use for all kinds of interesting things, right? And suddenly becomes a vibrant space with lots of people, bicyclists, like I mentioned, fishermen and things like that, right? So anyway, you can imagine wanting to eat lunch here or just sitting there or if you're there for an architectural tour, walking through this thing, taking photos. Color to represent a mood, right? Maybe it's at nighttime. Maybe you're adding, all these sort of screens and advertisements. This feels like Las Vegas or New York, or sorry, Times Square or something like that, right? Piccadilly Circus, with all these sort of glowing billboards and advertisements, people on the ground, maybe a few cars, but at night and everything's sort of lit up and bright. Again, this is not photorealistic. This is very much a collage talking about different sorts of materials and textures, right? And in fact, when you look at this, the details, they don't really necessarily make sense. But as a sort of a photorealistic rendering or sort of representation of a space, it's more of a collage talking about how the space might be used and all the sort of layers of different materials and activity that might occur there, right? Again, it works even though it's not photorealistic. There's a story behind this, right? We have these sunflowers, we have these weird sort of pink orbs. All the humans are grayscale, a hot air balloon, field of yellow, some folks on a track. Okay. Color indicating program, right? In other words, the foreground here and midground are what actually have color added to them, except for a few things that are floating in the sky or projected up at the top, right? What I mean by program is how these things are being used, right? So when we say like let's insert some program in there, it'd be like, okay, let's insert a cafe, let's insert furniture. Let's show people using the space, etc. An emotional response, right? Again, all the ingredients are here to make potentially a photorealistic image, but instead the idea is to tell a story, right? Um, one in which the person feels like they're drifting through a space and all these different layers. You have the yellows and orange yellow values with the blues, right? So split complementary, blue to orange yellow. And let's see, you even have a little bit of violet in some of these. Uh, so maybe it's two complements, right? Yellow and violet, orange and blue. I'll just keep going here. Oftentimes, this says the versus the bird's eye view, where we're in a helicopter looking down. Oftentimes, we try to make eye level perspective so that we can feel or show people what they would see when they're actually there, right? Oftentimes, we don't experience architecture up in a helicopter or flying over it. You know, the occasional takeoff from the airport, etc. But or maybe a helicopter ride to the Grand Canyon or whatever it is. But oftentimes we're experiencing these things in person, wherever our eye level is off the floor or the ground. Okay, so you're getting the idea here, right? I hope. Framing the view. Here we have trees on the left and the right-hand side that sort of extend over, right? Sort of reinforcing left and right sides of the frame. It's another device you can use. Some of these are better than others, right? You can tell some of these are model photographs, right? So this is a photograph of a model that then's repeated back and forth. So this one's just this one flipped and then lowered, and this one's the other one, but again, pushed up and down. You can start to add, collage elements to this. Let's say trees, humans, all the sort of components are here to sort of make a quick experiential drawing, right? So it does, you can even use a physical model and photograph it and then start to riff off of this and collage it up. If you don't have a virtual model, start it in Rhino or Revit or whatever. Okay. All right. So let me just show you some examples from here that I hope will reinforce this. Again, this is from teaching second year students way back when, 2018, pre-pandemic. Those were the days. 2018. Wow, I can't even remember what life was like back then. All right. Here we go, right? Not photorealistic. At the expense of photorealism, we have story being told here, right? Which is one of a landscape that sort of dramatically drops off into a waterfront, right? We have a cliff over here, rocky cliff, and we have architecture that sort of rises from that and then cantilevers out over, although the frame sort of cuts it off. We have the cityscape back beyond, sort of glowing and reflecting in the water, and sort of a dusk sky. The sky and the water are all the blues and greens, right? So this is an analogous color scheme. We have blues, greens, maybe just a little bit of golds in some of these, right? So those three values along the color wheel, those hues. In fact, we even have some green blues right here, right in the structure that looks very much like just a Rhino screen capture in a way, right? So here they added some materials, and here it's still just like a line drawing with some tone and reflections added. Here's another one, right? Again, not not photorealistic, but I think effective in showing or telling a story about a space that's completely augmented, enhanced, and integrated with technology. So you start to see these screens with interfaces that you just simply interact with. You can use with your phone or gesture with, all while sort of looking out beyond, sort of like when you have the Quest or Apple Provision, the sort of see through the sort of you can see through the screens and see that landscape beyond, etc. They pass through. All right. So there was the actual model, like in Rhino or something. Very, very, I mean, very, very, very primitive looking rendering, right? Some transparent glass, just a couple of shaders that sort of give some texture as well as some color. It's not trying to actually make real grass, just a sort of green flat color. Um, I'm not sure if this is actually has it looks like it has a little bit of tone, sort of grit to it, like there's a little bit of wood grain, but it's not repetitive, it's toned down. Um, yeah, and then you can see, right, what you do with it afterwards in Photoshop. Um, Again, you can still see some of that tone here, but it starts to look like texture and um, for the image rather than maybe a material, right? I think it's really interesting. They also added lighting. They did a bunch of color filters and things like that. They superimposed a bunch of graphics that they drew in Illustrator as line work and then made it glow, right? Give it an outer glow and an inner glow. So we'll talk about the nuances. We'll open up Photoshop here in a bit, and that's what we're going to go over for the next couple of weeks, I think, or at least the next week or two. You can see again. Um, in fact, this is really easy to do. Um, this is just using a feathered brush, a large feathered brush, and painting some orange and red, and then making it an overlay layer. It's like something you can do in 10 seconds. Anyway, kind of fun. All right, so instead of striving for pseudo photorealism, these drawings explore and exploit its artificiality, making us as viewers aware that we aren't looking at a space as, or we're looking at a space as a fictional form of representation. This is in strict opposition to digital rendering's desire to make the fiction seem real, right? So I think, um, we saw this shift. When we first got these digital tools, the whole idea was like, it's kind of similar to the first Jurassic Park film, right? Like, how do we convince people that what we're rendering is as real as possible to sell this project? But now we sort of have grown past that and sort of seen this medium as having its own sort of imprint on the results, right? Not necessarily just trying to do what we could do with the camera, right? So what is collage, photomontage, and composites, right? Collage, if you haven't done this before, I used to do this in art class a million years ago. You have to cut up all kinds of things. You had magazines. You go to the doctor's office and ask if they had any back issues of magazines from the waiting room. Maybe get a couple of catalogs back when they used to give you like these huge thick catalogs for around Christmas time. You'd save those things just so you could start cutting things up for colors, textures, maybe people or whatever it is, and start to sort of lay these things up with glue and start to piece. So collage used to be a very physical making sort of way of making art, and now can be digital as well. A combination or collection of various things layered onto each other, sticking various different materials, photographs, pieces of paper, or fabric onto a backing in order to create a new composition from a series of parts. Photomontage, sort of process or technique of selecting, editing, and piecing together separate sections of photos to form a continuous whole. Digital montaging, photomontaging, that's what we do in Photoshop. And a composite, right? Again, so you can use all of these words interchangeably, sort of the language of design. Collage, photomontage, composite, right? Made up of various parts or elements, not simple in structure. Composite is something it's kind of more complex, made up of lots of individual pieces that then create a larger whole. Okay, let's see. Images zapping by in rapid fire succession, which is why collage is such an effective way of representing contemporary life. The blur between images creates a kind of motion in the mind. Oh, that's a beautiful quote. Okay, so anyway, here you'll see some examples, right? Again, this was probably from a Rhino model or something, or a Revit model. And then all this other stuff was just montaged together, right, from photos and things like that, textures for grass, midground, and then a background, right? This is very much meant to look like a collage and not photorealistic, right? You can see that we have some unrealistic edges here, right? If we actually had grass mounting up here, then this stuff would be sort of, making a very soft edge here at the bottom of these walls, etc., right? And then the perspective is a little off, right? It's meant to tell an idea and show an idea here. Here's another example. Again, not photorealistic. In fact, it looks like they've done a lot of filters, but Look at the weight. The visual emphasis is all down here, right? The frame extends all the way up here, right? But we basically have a bottom half and a top half to this, right? You can use the old David Hockney sort of method of, you know, like he used to take lots of photos of a scene and then stitch them together. But they would purposely look like a sort of collage, mosaic sort of collage. Here you could do the same thing and break down the frame or start to place different pieces of sky, break things up, right? Maybe you break the frame. So now suddenly we have what looks like not a rectangular composition, but one that sort of reinforces again the perspective of this path, the perspective of this mid-ground background, and then of the architecture and you know, what's interesting is they broke where they broke the sort of background, right? The bird, this human, and this human, right? The path is actually negative space. Interesting, right? So again, these are lots of famous examples of this was an architectural example from Archigram back in the 60s. So this was done like physically with like, you know, like arranging paper and photos. Again, not necessarily photorealistic, but telling a story, right? So here's a column, what looks like maybe a canopy going over, but it's sort of breaking up this sort of landscape between two different vibes here, adding people to this sort of weird um, uh, sort of alien landscape of just a flat plain with a grid on it, amongst all this sort of natural landscape. You can tell this was in the 60s or 70s, right? I mean, it doesn't get much more 60s, 70s than that. All right, so, but again, right, you know, this is just a collage, right, of various images of textures and blooms and plants. Or you can think about the same thing in your ortho drawings, right? This is pretty excessive, in my opinion. I think you guys were doing a much better job without all the excessive sort of color and things like that. Here's one where very selective use of color, right? So we see the architecture in city as grayscale, sort of human made. And then we see the sort of nature taking over and the sort of that's where we actually have color and saturation, right? This was I think this was a competition entry for Warming Hut up in somewhere in Canada, Manitoba or something. But anyway, you can see that again, the architecture is actually just a series of white lines. It's sort of negative space again against a textured sky, which that's the way the sky looks in places where it snows and gets cold. Like in October, you just say goodbye to the sky, you don't see it, or the sun, you don't see it again until March. Um, and the ground plane is actually not that clean. It's usually like lots of piles of snow and then brown piles of snow as the salt mixes with it and then it gets muddy and ugh, it's gross. Anyway, I love the desert. That's why I moved here. Anyway, as you can see, leaves, butterflies, whatever this stuff is, I think leaves, right? This idea that this becomes a sort of pergola or lattice to then grow stuff on. So I'll just go through some of these. But again, you can see, you know, the pattern here is that I hope you think about this as having some freedom to really sort of say, what's my idea? Now, how do I best tell that story? How do I best reflect that idea, represent that idea? Not necessarily how do I best, you know, make this thing look like a photograph of what I have in my head, right? It doesn't have to be photographic and, you know, photorealistic, right? This tells a more interesting story, actually. Again, the David Hockney sort of um, strategy. This is interesting, right? Again, taking a cityscape and then finding a bunch of trees, oversized trees, and then starting to plant them like it's a sort of a urban forest, right? I don't know how much this applies to any of your projects, but you know, these are examples of collages, photomontages, etc., right? So, you know, You never know. They might get your brain going, right? Here's part of a plan, right? This is a topography. This is landscape. And then there's this sort of collage, sort of swatches of different materials that happen to occur at each of these elevations. Right? This is done by James Corner, field operations, one of the most famous landscape architects alive right now. Right? Another field op diagram. Right? This thing isn't cluttered with like every little detail nuanced of like the railings that would be at the edges and or like the air handling system that would be going on up here, right? The idea is very clear, right? These two planes, you exist within that. Look at what it's framing, right? The horizon with the landscape halfway and the sky the other half. In fact, you can even sit in here and have things framed for you if you'd like. And it works somehow with this sort of structural logic of these huge truss system that's the ceiling is hung from and that the floor is sitting on, right? So this is always the balance counterbalance, right? How far do you go with detail, right? Revit wants you to add every little detail. It asks you like, what kind of doorknob do you want? And that's the last thing you should be worrying about, right? Think about the composition of surfaces and how they interact with light, how light can wash or cast shadows onto these things. Here's an example, right? Here's a landscape. And I'm guessing this was just like looks like a surface model in Rhino. Then they just added grass texture on the top and a sort of Corten steel, sort of pre-weathered, um, retaining surface here, plate steel or something. You wouldn't actually want to fall on this, by the way, with your knee or your head or anything. Eesh. Looks pretty though, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, right. I mean, this is quite literally collage of different sort of photographs montaged together. Okay. Again, another collage, making the sky. It's actually about 30 different skies that sort of they've pieced together and to play around with different times of the year, different times of the day, adding textures, quite literally sort of breaking up that sort of fourth wall and sort of putting the frame as if you're looking at this through a window or somehow. This isn't quite literal water. This is like a point cloud. Then it starts to look like waves. By the way, this is really easy to do as well. You just like make some noise and then you add a motion blur that streaks it in a particular direction. Running through a meadow with pollen in the air. This weird dude. All right. So anyway, but you can see, right? There's lots of different ways you can think about these things. They don't have to be photorealistic. In fact, what we've been doing thus far is playing around the scale, adding entourage that's just silhouettes, right? Just to get a sense of scale and activity program. Again, not photorealistic. There are some things that are photorealistic and some things that are very painterly. Mixing them together can be kind of jarring. If that's the point, could try it. Right? Okay. So anyway, I wanted to show you guys that. And as a precursor to what we're going to be talking about this week. So here's a very quick example of taking something that was modeled quickly in Rhino, cutting a section through it with a clipping plane, bringing out the sort of section perspective as a PNG file, and then starting to lay some things up, not even really done, just a few things, starting to lay a few things up in Photoshop, right? So if we look over down here in the bottom right-hand corner of Photoshop, you'll see that I have a box called layers. You'll see that I have lots of different layers here. Trying to think what some of these layers actually are. All right. So let's take a look at this one, for instance. Okay, you might not notice it till I zoom in a little further, but you see this surface, I just added just a small sort of concrete texture to it, right? I took that off. I think this was also the pavement, right? You can see that there's several different approaches here for casting shadows from people. I added people in. So let's see, there's a person, and that's him, but actually just skewed down, and then turned down and sat or sorry, turned down and brightness to black, and then just make it slightly transparent. Or we could always go in with a brush and just sort of add a sort of small smudge like we did here, right? It's just soft shadows, not hard, crisp shadows. Get rid of some more humans. It looks like at some point I actually just took a brush and painted right into this layer instead of adding my own layer. But there was the original Rhino image, a PNG. Here we have all the sort of ground surface and stuff. I was starting to hide the horizon. Didn't really get very far. And of course, a sky that we can put in behind, right? You can see this is very much like a stage set, how we do these things, lay these things up. That's one quick example, and we can start playing around with this with the rendering underlay that I have tomorrow. I will do some demonstrations. Here's a this does look familiar to you. This is what the that post office building on the north side of your site looked like when they had all the facade off, and it was really pretty much gutted. There's the parking lot across the street. There's that parking garage on Carson and Fifth, right? So this is Las Vegas Boulevard, and it was a big construction site for a long time. Um, what's interesting is that this is Google Street View. I didn't even go there. And then this is putting it in as just a little bit of background sort of ambiance, right? But then suddenly it suggested where the perspective was, right? So if I think about this just for a moment, yeah, let me just get out my annotate tools, right? You can see that there's quite a clear 1 point perspective that, sort of lines up somewhere over here. If I could draw a straight line with this mouse, I would. Sorry. Um, anyway, trying to sort of line things up with that. And then of course we have the other second 2 point perspective. It's not quite a 1 point perspective, but a 2 point perspective way off the screen here, right? Um, but this again was just a quick Rhino model. Let's see, what kind of layers do I have in here? Oh, this is a PNG. Well, that's interesting. Let me see if I can find the PSD file. That would be most helpful here. Let's see. Always something with this, right? Yeah, let me open up this PSD file. Sorry, open up the wrong thing. The PSD file is a Photoshop document. It actually saves all the layers and things like that. So you can see here, I was just simply taking the photograph of wood paneling and then applying it to different places on this thing, right? So there's that and that and that. You can sort of, again, sort of reverse engineer this thing. Looks like this one's labeled concrete texture. Let's see what happens when I turn that off. Okay, yeah. So I had something where I made a texture to go along here, made an overlay layer. Let's see, what is this? Humans, right? Again, let's see here. Eye level, if they're all about the same size, all about the same height, their eye level should be about the same, right? And then where their feet hit is what sort of showing you where they are in space then, right? So that's how you handle human figures in perspective, right? You find that eye level, and if it's the same eye level as you, it's really easy. Everybody goes along that eye level, and then you basically scale from there. What let's see here. We can turn those off, turn that off, that guy off, that tree off. Paving pattern on the ground. This is something I added. The base rendering. You can see there's that image from Google Earth again. And this is what I brought in from Rhino. Okay. So we lay things up. I decide what we want to add emphasis to. This isn't even done, but just really quick sort of things that we can go over and talk about, right? Let's see, render capture. Oh, here's another one, right? Another PSD. Again, quite a I mean, this is obviously a collage, right? It's not meant to be photorealistic. We have our model from Rhino. Some of this looks a little goofy, but let's see here. There's our tree in the sort of foreground. There's our wood paneling up there. For better or worse, I'm not fond of that wood paneling, but we have concrete texture on this. We can keep adding. Right? Then we can start to add vegetation and things like that, layers of landscape. There's grass that I did it sort of David Hockney, sort of, I don't mind if I see some of the seams. If I wanted to get rid of some of those seams, I could clone stamp them out and, clone stamp the edges, basically. Be a little more careful about that. There's the model I started with in Rhino. There's some grasses and there's a tree. There's the sky. So that was just an image of a land, just barely the sort of upper rim of some sort of canyon, it looks like, but the sky is what they were focused on. And that was what I brought in from Rhino. Right. So this is the kind of stuff we'll be working on for a while. Anything else? Like, let me see if there's anything else I would bring in here to sort of quickly reverse engineer. There's this. Ah, yeah, okay. Let me open this up. Or just simply, here's what I brought in from Rhino. It looks, or Revit, one or the other, right? But you can sort of see that, this is casting light here. This is casting light over here. And now suddenly I can come in and start to project those light rays through, try to give it some atmospherics, right? To sort of talk about that phenomena of, light streaming through, for instance, right? This looks very much like some of the stuff you guys have been working on, right? Um, Series of planes and openings. And really, I think this is the next key, right? Over this week, you're going to be identifying interior places. I don't care about what the outside looks like at the moment. The interior spaces, and starting to frame different perspectives, bringing those into Photoshop, and then we begin to sort of play around with what we see. So it's very much geared towards, when you were doing your section studies, right? You were looking at the inside of this space and sort of saying, well, this is interesting. Let's move the sun and see what happens, and trying to find interesting sort of relationships between your interior spaces and light from the outs coming from the outside, right? If not, we'll also be doing more of that this week, right? But these are the kinds of opportunities we'll be looking at, right? From here, I would need to add maybe some, tones and textures, materials, maybe a little bit of color, some humans to show scale. I think that's what really missing. I look at this and I go, am I at eye level? And a human is this big? Or, are we talking about, humans that are this big, right? With their shadows casting on the ground. So, I think that's an open question, right? When you look at these things, what is the scale, right? That's what humans and trees and things like that all sort of help our brains figure out, without us really even having to think about it. We start to understand the scale better, right? We're very, I mean, we look at everything through an anthropocentric lens, right? We sort of see the world as humans, by humans, for humans. So we can't help it when we see a human figure in these things, with silhouettes or, photoshopped someone, being a mime or holding balloons or whatever it is, right? Like suddenly we see, oh, okay. Not only do I know the scale, but I can also imagine what other people are doing in that space, right? So, all right. Let's see. Really quickly, I'm trying to think of a few things to show you guys, but I think I'll start at the very first thing here, and that is we've been talking a little bit about how to make 3D views in Revit and Rhino. I'll show you how you can change the camera again in Rhino and then save perspective views. With Revit, when you make them and you drag the camera, then you've made them. So we'll just go over that really quickly because that's what I want you guys to do first between now and tomorrow is start to go through your models and start to pull out either in Rhino or Revit, whichever one you want, but start to actually make some perspectives that you want to bring into export out and bring into Photoshop to start working with. Let's see, parallels. Again, I'm still recording. Damn, parallels, stop it. Leave me alone. I don't want to install an update right now. Sure. Why do I always have to allow that? I don't get it. All right. No, I accidentally installed Parallels and then executed it on. Come on. Of course, I want it to be able to run. All right. So it'll just be another minute, but let's talk about the steps to do here in your CAD platform. Again, it could be Revit, could be Rhino, whatever you're using at this point. Your latest and greatest is in. Either one will work, right? Again, you just want to make sure that you have renders, shading, sun, paths, all that sort of stuff turned on because that's what we're really looking at. That's the key here. I'm going to do Rhino first, maybe if it ever opens. All right. There it is. I'll just do this one really quickly. Waiting. It grosses me out that Rhino's become so bloated. It takes this long to actually open now. Used to be the lighter of the softwares. Come on. Awesome. I wonder what that is. All right. Any day now. But the key thing is that you can actually save these views. So if you get the perfect perspective, but then you want to go back to it later because you've changed the camera, like that stinks, right? Like you want to be able to like go right back to the exact same perspective with the exact same camera position, settings, looking at the exact same target, right? So there's a way to easily do that in Rhino. Let's just talk about that, and then again we'll go through the motions here and Revit as well. Okay. But while this is opening up still, again, my reminder to you that between now and tomorrow, I just want you to do the same thing, either in Rhino or Revit, depending on which platform you're using at the moment. Wherever your latest and greatest model is, start to look at these interior spaces, start to get some perspectives, and start to bring out some PNGs of these perspectives. And what I'm about to show you right now, so that tomorrow we can start to Photoshop the pucky out of them. All right. The spinning blue wheel. Gosh, I think Revit's faster than this. Good grief. Right. Okay. Yeah, let's say I'm doing that one, whatever. But the key thing is I think, oh, first of all, I have a clipping plane on, don't I? So, clipping plane. I'll just delete the clipping plane. Okay, there we go. Oh, I see. It's this display mode that I have on right now. Yeah, let's turn this to some, there we go. All right, now I can just move around freely. Let's say I do want to sort of pinpoint one exact sort of perspective. So there's a couple of things I'm looking at here. One is where I'm located and what I'm looking at, but then there's also how much that I'm looking through, right? So lens length is set to 25 millimeter. So maybe I want to scoot back a little bit. And if I really want to get a little more granular with how far I zoom in or out, I can use this tool. Okay. And I can always turn this down even further if I need to, just to get a little more context in. Yeah, okay. So I'm looking down this corridor. There's some sun baffles over here that sort of bring in south sun. Oops, come on now. And sort of bounce them down in. And I'm actually adjacent to one of these spaces that actually looks down to a second space down below, etc. So it looks like a decently rich perspective. Anyway, let me close the annotate tools. So over here in the viewport label, right? You can see that when we go to set view, we have things like top, bottom, left, right, front, back, perspective, 2-point perspective, isometric. We also have something called named views, right? So if I go to named views, it's going to pull up a box over here. And I don't have any named views. In other words, I haven't saved any new views that I wanted to name and go back to later. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hit this camera with a plus sign and say save as. And this is going to be called, I'll call this interior perspective 01 or something like that. Okay. Now, if I screw something up and I'm out here and I want to go back to this, I can just double click it. I'm back to it with all the camera properties that I had before. If I can't find this named view box, when I go here and I go to set view, I'll have all the same options that I had before, top, bottom, left, right, front, back, perspective, two-point perspective, isometric, but I also have any named views that I have. So interior perspective is right here. Okay. So from there, I can then go ahead and if I have this and it's perfect, don't want to lose it, I can, then bring me there and go ahead and turn the right things on. And I can say capture to file, right? Transparent background. And make sure this is set to PNG. And I'll call this perspective test 01, since I'll be using that tomorrow, maybe. All right. Get taken in a second because I had to add twice as many pixels into the width and the height, so 4 times as many pixels as it did before. So it's got to render this out. with 4 times the amount of information. So take a minute, but after that, it should be good. Now I'm going to go ahead and set the display mode back to shaded and now save. So when I open it back up, it won't be so laggy. So anyway, that's how you can do these things in Rhino, right? Get inside, find that perfect where I'm standing, what I'm looking at, the frame and the frame size, right? It's not lost on me that you might not want a horizontal or landscape format frame. Maybe if it's a tall space, you want a vertical frame. You can always take your viewport and turn it into something that's more vertical. And now suddenly you'll have a frame that's like that, right? I don't like having this wall right in the foreground. Let me see if I can just move up just a smidge there. There we go. Right. And then when I do that again, I could again save this view. And that's the key. You don't want to forget to save the views once you have them. So you can always go back to them, re-render them, etc. Right? Now, really quickly, let's see here. Oh, we're about to run out of time. So let me just go ahead and close Rhino and let's open up Revit and let's do the same thing. Right? Just again as a quick reminder. All right, but this is what I want you to do. I want you to find at least for tomorrow, at least 3 interior spaces that you have perspectives lined up for. Bring those out as PNG files, and that'll be our sort of first stab at bringing those into Photoshop and then collaging things in. Okay. Just waiting on Revit to open. I wouldn't think it'd take too long here. Double check and make sure it's actually opening. Here we go. All right, all right, all right. Just waiting. All right. Well, the splash screen's up, so hopefully soon. Just waiting, waiting, waiting. All right, almost there. Ugh, recent files, right? Why don't I have any recent files? Oh, there we go. All right, whatever. Still waiting. My apologies for all the waiting. If I have all these things loaded up all at once, then they all run really slow and they make my computer run really slow. And sometimes parallels in my graphics card and my MacBook Pro don't like each other. So the screen will turn black and it's not good. So sorry, I apologize. I have to open these things up time after time here. But let's say I'm just going to, I don't know, let's go to the second floor. Yeah, so you can't really see much in my plan views. I'll just go to Axon view here. Right. So again, to create a new perspective view, 3D view, what Revit calls a 3D view here. Let me just move that tool out of the way from zoom. Go to the view tab, 3D view, camera, right? Then I can place a camera and then sort of point it at something over here. And now I'll have a 3D view number two. That's what that camera is looking at. Okay, I'm not going to click on anything. I'm just going to zoom out a bit. Now I still have this frame. I can pull this out and stretch it out to see a little better. But what's interesting is that, it's still looking at that camera and what I can see, far clip offset has a far clip offset 173 for whatever reason. I'll just add something ridiculously large like 400 to it. That way nothing actually gets clipped at the end. Eye elevation. So it puts me at 5'6" from the ground from level one. So I'm actually going to lift this up a bit. Let's say 25'6". And the target I'm looking at will also be 25 feet up off the. Oh, come on. What are you doing here? There we go. Apply. If I go to Axon, I should still see that camera. And I'm just going to try to move it over here. Let's see. Right. And again, I can change the viewport frame, right? Let's see here. Where am I? Where's my camera? Let's go to site plan and see where my camera, if it's located on here. Yeah, here, okay. There we go. Now I'm not actually in the wall. I'm actually adjacent to that wall. Let's see, site plan. Let's move it up there. Right, so I can move the camera around as needed. Eye elevation, target elevation. Let's just put that again at 25 feet. I don't know why it keeps changing. There we go. That's better. That's exactly what I want to see. There. I was like wondering why it wasn't working for me. There we are. Yeah. Now again, I can change this to maybe shaded, turn the sun on. There we go. Shadows, etc. Yeah. Anyway, so you can see that, again, I can then file. Ah, come on. Export. Go down here. Images and animations. Image. Um, the current window. Yeah. Let's see. PNG, non-shaded views, PNG. I can say fit to 1500 pixels or something like that. Change where I let's see, save it. Let's see. Da, 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 da. Home, desktop. And I'll call this interior perspective 02. So I'll have two to sort of play around with. I'm pretty sure I said save as a PNG, so let me try that. Right. Okie doke. Now, when I get here and I say, well, the lighting kind of sucks, the way to change that is to go to the sun settings, right? And let's change it. It has an azimuth and altitude. I could do single day, and I could, set it maybe to the day, but at 11, let's see, apply, or whatever. I can begin to play around with these things, sort of see where the shadows hit. All right. So anyway, then go ahead and export a perspective again. This will be here. It's 3D view too, right? So if you go to 3D views, all of these that we've made are down here, right? Including perspectives, interiors, etc. Right? When I was showing some of these things, there's an exterior perspective. Here's one looking this way, whatever, right? So again, you're saving these things as you make them in Revit. In Rhino, you get it positioned perfectly. You want to make sure then that you want to make sure that you save the view. It won't save it automatically for you, but if you save it, you can always go right back to it. It's really nice. Okay. Okie doke. All right. Are we clear on what I want you to do between now and tomorrow?
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. So, any questions? All right. I'd like to end a little early today since I have to run over to campus for afternoon studio. So if there's no questions, then I'll see three of you this afternoon, and I'll see Anna. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll start doing some Photoshop then. Sound good?
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.